Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you for coming out on a, thankfully, briefly stopped raining, I think, on this Monday evening. Absolutely, as Adrian says, I'm conscious that I'm in a room where half of you will probably know more about what I'm talking about than I do. It's a very knowledgeable audience as far as I can hear the various conversations kicking off. So do just pop out questions, thoughts as we go. I'd like to learn as much from you as you perhaps hope to learn from me. So let's keep it as interactive as you wish. As Adrian said, I'm Dr. Jason Tisdall. So my PhD is actually in robotics back in the day, so automation and robotics. And I spent many years in the offshore oil and gas industry. So I was doing, with my business partner, we built up a software company which created engineering software for subsea robotics. And it went very well, but over time we grew more and more uneasy about climate change. We were learning more about climate change. It seemed an unassailable fact, and it was with great relief actually that we jumped ship. So we like to say we are poacher turned gamekeeper, and it's interesting, just very personally, there was a huge relief, far more than I expected, to actually move away from having all my energy behind generating fossil fuels to doing something alternative. So personally, I found that a great relief as time went by. Personally, I'm married. I have 3 sons. I certainly would like them to inherit a planet that keeps functioning for the long term. I have my mother-in-law here as well, which is very lovely. I hope you find the talk interesting, and just fire away with any questions that come up. So I'm focusing, what is energy? It's sort of a trivial question, but perhaps quite interesting just to remind ourselves what some of the elements are. Heat, perhaps one of the most prevalent forms of energy, very conscious when it's there, very conscious when it's not there of an evening and the central heating breaks down. Light, really useful form of energy, very ubiquitous. Electrical energy, the driving force for so many of our time and space-saving tools and devices, really the powering force for the modern world. Mechanical engineering, so when anything's rotating, it has energy born in it. When anything's moving, it has energy born within it. Nuclear energy, the energy released from subatomic particles when they change form. Gravity, so potential. When I'm holding something up high, it can fall under the force of gravity. That's a useful form of energy. Sound energy, much weaker form of energy, but very prevalent, very useful, certainly in communication, not so much in the context of heating our homes. And chemical energy, a really useful way of storing all sorts of energy. And there's another way perhaps of looking at it, which is the breakdown between kinetic energy, something that's moving is kinetic, and stored energy, potential energy. So if you can store it, then you can use it at a later time. Kinetic energy, by its nature, it's dissipating now. Any energy we use dissipates as we use it, generally gradually degrading through various forms of energy until it becomes heat. That's the generalized waste heat. So kinetic is moving. Examples, electricity is a form of kinetic energy. It's constantly moving. Rotating machines, anything to do with your cars or your bicycles, they're kinetic energy in action. Potential, stored energy, a gallon of petrol, a storage battery, and a lot of my focus tonight is on batteries. So, question, how did we generate and store energy in the olden days, pre-industrial? Essentially, we grew things, food, crops, and we burnt things, log fires, all those sources of energy, coal, peat, other things that lay hands on, and we burnt it to create heat. But in the modern age, of course, everything changed. Now, of course, we grow things and we burn things. So has it really changed at all? That's my question to you. It has, but it didn't change that much. We still grow and mine stuff to burn. God knows we mine an awful lot of fossil fuels to burn, and we're seeing the consequences of that unforeseen in past times, but we know about it now. We still use the heat to do useful stuff. It's the core of modern life. We could not have any of our modern life at the moment without sources of energy. But what really changed was the form of energy we used and how we started to store it. So the really big transition, in my view, was the move to electricity. Easily transmissible energy form, and the uses just keep growing. Every day a gazillion new devices appear on the market, most of them of no use to anyone that I can see, but nonetheless it drives our society and is incredibly useful. So managing electricity becomes a really important factor, the bedrock of the modern world. We have supply, often unfortunately smoky, oily, burny things. And we have demand, our homes, our factories, our transport networks, where we have huge demands on the electricity. Now managing electricity is quite an interesting one. This is a publicly available website where you can actually see the state of the grid, where the energy is coming from, where it's being generated right now. Some of you may have come across this or similar sites yourself. So we can see just at a high level, in this particular moment in time, we have just over 10 gigawatts of wind energy being generated, gas just over 18 gigawatts, nuclear 6, coal 5, and then we've got an overall demand 43.5 gigawatts of electricity. This is just the UK, of course. And the frequency, it's really important. Our electricity network maintains as close to 50 hertz as it can. So the detail of this is telling us where our energy is coming from. These are accrued from a range of sources. Currently solar is only intermittently included in these, and there's some fairly crude estimates of how much solar comes into these. And this is the website if you're interested. It's quite nice to have a look, and you can look historically at all sorts of useful things. A particular historical one of interest to me was this one, 2018, and we were pretty much maxed out on gas, on nuclear, on coal. Frequency was still good, demand just under 50 gigawatts. That was an absolute peak. Had it not been a windy night, we probably would have seen some parts of the country trip out. So that was as close as we've got, I think, in recent years to just not being able to supply the demands. So it's really a critical part of our energy picture is how we manage the electricity, how the DNOs, the network operators manage this complex network. So we have supply and we have demand, and in an ideal world, they're equal. We have exactly the right amount supplied and exactly the right amount demanded. But of course, in the real world, it almost never is equal. Sometimes gets close, sometimes crosses over, but it's almost never equal. And so what we need is a way to store it. And we need it to store it both to take surplus from the network if we suddenly have too much being generated, but also to store it, to provide it back to the network if we suddenly have a hike in demand. This allows us to do a few key things in terms of making our network secure. So first is frequency control. I mentioned the 50 hertz. That is really critical. If you try and take more energy from the system than there is, that frequency starts to drop. And that has bad consequences for the stability of the whole system. Network stability is critical for the system. And in fact, DNOs, the network operators, have very strict guidelines and very big fines imposed if they go out very tight tolerances of that frequency, 50 hertz. So it's very important to them that they can manage that in a way that keeps us safe. Where we've seen big trip outs in systems in the past, you remember the East Coast power failure in America some years ago, one of the driving forces for that was once the frequency went out of the right range, it triggered all sorts of fault responses in the network, fault tolerant responses. We want to store it to plan. We think, oh, winter's coming, we need more fuel, we're going to get colder. Summer, perhaps we can do with a bit less. Load spreading and efficiency. The reality of networks, I mean, we see an extreme example of this in Australia, where they're really stretched out along long coasts, and they have big problems distributing the demand and the supply along that very long straight line of cables, essentially. You get pinch points where there just isn't the capacity to carry the energy that you'd like to be able to carry. And you lose energy. When you transmit it long distances, you lose energy. It just gets wasted. It dissipates as heat. So the less you have to transmit it, the better. This is quite. This is from a government website, just a winter's day, December 2012. GB electricity demand winter profile. That's average over the whole country. Obviously, in local localities, you get it more extreme than that. And if we look at it, an average, somewhere around here. So we can see there's parts of the day when we're way below that, we just don't need that much energy, and there's parts when we're way above it. And that blue line there, over the average that we go, in this case represents about 8 gigawatts, almost a mind-boggling amount of energy. About 14% of our total capacity is needed to cope with that peak. So we can see that if we can manage storage better than we do now, we'd have the potential to pull the peaks down and raise the troughs up. If we could transfer the energy from here, from the spare energy here to the demand here, we could massively reduce the amount of energy we need to generate. Sort of implicit within that are solutions to question. People say things like, we can't move to electric cars, we can't generate enough electricity. A lot of the reality of how we're going to meet those challenges is through time-shifting generation, so that our actual generation can be more like the average rather than like the peak. It's a really critical part of our futures. So, we know we want to spread out electricity, we want to reduce our overall generating peaks. How do we do it? How do we store the electricity so that we can achieve those goals? So, how we store it? We store it as heat. We can store it as capacitors. Heat, if you heat your home water tank, that's all well and good, but if you just leave it there for a week and you come back, you're not going to have a very hot shower, are you? It will gradually leak away. Capacitors, these store electricity, typically much shorter periods of time. They'll start leaking away. Although you can have very high, quick power from capacitors on occasion. Flywheels, very neat solutions for storing mechanical energy. You can see, there's been some clever applications with flywheels in Formula One and things like that, where energy is literally moved from the wheels on the road into a flywheel, and then it can be transferred back again very smoothly. It can be used for a very high power, short-term energy supply. Liquefied air, another way to store energy. You put the energy in by turning air into a liquid, and then you can bring it out to drive turbines or all sorts of tools at a later date. Interesting, that's a sort of chemical storage. Hydroelectric. You may not know, but this is one of the critical short to medium term energy storage pieces that allows our grid to work. Now, there's natural hydroelectric. You've just got a river, you dam it, and you're constantly running the water down through a turbine generating electricity. That's all well and good. But a really clever thing that gets used is pumped storage, where the water flows down when you need the electricity, and then later you use the surplus energy to pump it back up the hill. So it regains its gravitational potential, it's at the top of the hill, and then when you need it, you can release it back down again. So these are one of the key mechanisms for frequency balancing currently in the grid, short-term demand spikes. We couldn't manage our system currently without quite a lot of pumped storage and regular hydro. Do shout out if any of this isn't making sense, or
what sort of
any questions?
What sort of percentage can that generate?
Of our grid?
Can't be many percent of our
no,
total.
it's not many, but it's not insignificant. I think it's I was looking at a graph a couple of days ago, but I can't remember the number. I think it's around the sort of 3 or 4% mark.
Big storage in Wales, isn't there, and presumably others.
There's one in Scotland.
There's
Scotland.
quite a lot of them around.
Yeah.
Again, though, of course, this highlights the issue of it being centralised in key locations, large volumes of energy, if you like, which are centralised in certain locations. So if you're far away from those, then we've got to transmit the energy all the way. So these cause bottlenecks. A really exciting part of the sort of solar evolution of the world is that it enables energy to become much more localized, be generated and used localized with lower waste. And battery storage, chemical energy. Batteries are quite sophisticated. They're growing enormously in popularity. There's some big concerns often voiced about recycling. What problem are we storing up for the future? I've got a few comments on that a bit later on in the presentation as well. A big growth in batteries, particularly lithium-ion, a very well understood chemistry. But there's some really interesting alternatives as well with using liquid electrolytes, where you have a liquid electrolyte in a battery, and once it's charged, you can pump it away somewhere else and store it. So you can actually have great vats of fully charged battery, which can just be pumped in on demand. So some very interesting technologies coming into play with batteries. But what makes a storage method good? There isn't one that fits all, that's for sure. I mean, what trumps everything, of course, is cost. If it costs too much, then we can't use it. Cost is always a factor, and it's an important factor. You can argue about hidden costs versus real costs, and I know this room, I'm sure everyone here is concerned about climate change, and we know that one of the big concerns that underpins some of the systems that are still heading in the wrong direction is that true costs, the true long-term cost of fossil fuel, for example, is hidden. So cost is not a trivial topic, but it's a really important topic. Reversibility. So it's all very well being able to store energy into something, but if the cycle of putting it in and taking it out again were to lose 90% of the energy, then it might not be worth it. Whereas if you can store and get out 90% of the energy, then you've got a much more efficient, much more close to a truly reversible energy storage system. So that's a really important factor. Speed and responsiveness, this is key, particularly in the context of the grid, where it needs perhaps to have many megawatts of power turned on in a few milliseconds. You're just not going to be able to do that by firing up a cold gas-fired energy generation plant. Even less nuclear, something like that, that needs to run pretty much continuously and take up the sort of the baseline thing. But something like hydro or battery, very well suited to fast startup, quick delivery of high energy loads where they're needed. So it gives us the flexibility. Efficiency, I mentioned this round trip efficiency. Obviously, the higher the efficiency, the better, but sometimes you're willing to put up with lower efficiencies just because it's really convenient. And duration. The final thing, how long can we store energy for? This is a big challenge, you know, and needs a lot more work. So at the moment, often when I'm talking about batteries, I'm talking about domestic or small commercial energy storage. But really, battery storage is well suited for quite short timelines, sort of 24-hour cycles. It's not something where you can store all the energy in the summer and just leave it sitting there and pull it back out in the winter. It's not cost effectively. So there's some real big challenges there. Stored hydro, you can pump up water and leave it there for a long period of time, but it's an expensive way to do it. So duration is a big factor. Wind, this is always an issue for wind. When's it going to get stormy? When's it going to blow? You know, you can't rely on it to be there when you want it, unless you can time shift it through storage. So we're quite good at short timeline storage shifts, not so good at the longer timelines.
Should morality be on that list?
That's a good question.
When you consider the mines that are being operated by children to extract lithium and so forth.
Yeah, I guess that's part of what I was meaning by cost and hidden cost. But yes, you're right. Morality could really easily be a separate point.
Increasingly, I think it should be under CSR.
An ethical decision.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you.
Another thought is that you don't actually need to store things if you can get the power from somewhere else. So if you could move your electricity from, shall we say, a hot desert like the Middle East,
Yeah.
to here or whatever, then it could be at a time when they don't need it and you do, vice versa.
I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, all of them, there's always an engineering trade-off. So transmission losses may offset the storage costs. So you have to weigh those up. I read a fascinating sort of thought paper a few years ago now, where it's essentially mooting. If they covered the whole of the Sahara in solar, it could power the whole of Europe.
You need to cover the whole of the Sahara, would you?
You wouldn't even need to cover the whole of the Sahara, but a significant fraction of it could power all of Europe's energy sources. It could also, of course, push enormous amounts of revenue to an area which is very short of the share in world revenue. So some fascinating ideas there.
And you could move some of the high energy demand things like aluminium smelters rather than...
I can't really hear a word what's going on. But you've dropped your voice and you
I'm sorry.
I speak very
Thank
loud.
you.
You could move high energy demand things like aluminium smelters from where they are now in Europe to somewhere where the energy is being generated, like in the north coast of the Sahara.
Yeah, so, I mean, they're all interesting trade-offs. I mean, there's always, you know, for example, if you then have to ship millions of tons of bauxite to the Sahara, that may offset any energy gains you have from the other. But we're seeing interesting emerging technologies. The Chinese have done a lot of work on transmitting DC electricity, very long distances with low losses, very high voltages. So there's some really exciting things coming out there, and obviously, you know, if you're generating solar, you're dealing in DC. So if you can not even have to change it into AC to get effective transmission, it opens a lot of doors. I mean, they're all really about possibilities and intention, in my view. You know, if the will is there, we can achieve any of them. We do need to make good engineering choices, though, because they're not always obvious, and most choices have a downside to them. There is no golden bullet, I'd suggest.
What about hydrogen storage?
Hydrogen's pretty good. I think hydrogen's going to emerge as a strong candidate. I mean, essentially as a conversion of electricity into hydrogen, green electricity, obviously, and then using it. And I think it's going to become a really important part of the transport mix. So yeah, I'm watching hydrogen with a lot of interest myself. Saw a really interesting startup company, it was in Slough, I think, where they'd found a way to encapsulate hydrogen in polymer little small polymer lumps, if you like, so little
Granules.
beads, granules, exactly right. And therefore, you could use that as a way to distribute them. Just essentially pour granules into a tank, and then you'd take the granules out, and through a heat mechanism, you'd release the hydrogen, and then you power your fuel cell. I mean, there's quite a lot of losses at the moment in that whole cycle. So again, there's a disadvantage there, but these will reduce as the focus is given to those processes. So, how does this affect us? Storage is storage, it's all happening somewhere or other in various different ways. There's 5 key things, in my view, that are changing the game at the moment. There's solar panels, so low carbon, direct creation of electricity. And I mean, currently, depends exactly which papers you read, but it's reckoned it's about a 20th of the carbon footprint for the electricity generation over the life of the panel compared to gas generation. So it really is a significant reduction in carbon, but it's not zero, it's still carbon. Wind turbines, they're even lower carbon than solar panels, actually, when you look at the numbers. They're incredibly effective and very suitable for the UK on a large scale. They don't seem to scale down very well. Batteries are really changing the game. We've seen a huge growth of batteries, notwithstanding genuine concerns about ethics of some of the chemicals and about recycling and other questions like that. But they really do, good, welcome. They really do make a difference. The 4th thing on my list is the Internet of Things. So this is just causing an explosion in our ability to decentralize. And I think the ability to decentralize energy, power, controls, and I mean that both in a physics and a political sense, are key to our forward steps. Being able to move, small is beautiful, in my view. I think moving to smaller units that can be sustainable and successful will be a really important step for humanity. And of course, climate change. This is changing the game far more quickly than many predicted. It does seem to be gaining political notice, finally, in a more significant way, but far from one. It's far from certain. It's not a given that governments are